Hi everyone, my name is Gregor Suttie and welcome to my session today for Data Scotland. Today I will be talking to you about building an Azure data warehouse from scratch. Just before we continue, I would like to personally thank all of our sponsors for all the sponsors for the event today and all of the organisers. It takes a lot to organise these events and run them, so a huge big thank you personally from me to everyone involved, including all the sponsors. So let's get started and dive right in. So my name is Gregor Suttie and I live right here in Scotland, in between Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is known as the Central Belt of Scotland. I am an Azure architect for a company called Intercept, who are based in Zwolle, which is in the Netherlands. I am also a Microsoft MVP and also a Microsoft certified trainer. I am on Twitter at Gregor_Suttie, which is probably the best place to find me, but I'm also on LinkedIn. I also blog occasionally at gregorsuttie.com, and myself and Richard Hooper, also known as Pixel Robots on Twitter, we have a podcast and we also run the Cloud Family website, which is basically trying to help bring community members and useful resources to one place to make them easier to find. So that's the idea. So that's a little bit about me. So for today's agenda, I'd like to cover the following. I want to do a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about and why. Let's talk about data in general. Next up, we'll talk about data warehousing concepts. That's things like, what is a data warehouse? Do we even need a data warehouse? And what does having a data warehouse give us? After that, we'll talk about data in Azure. Where do I store it? How do I get data into Azure? Is it secure? Is it expensive? Then we'll put it all together. So here I'll show you what an Azure data warehouse is going to look like. And bear in mind, we have a lot of options available to us when we're building data warehouses, but we'll cover off some of those options. Then we'll go into some demos and we'll show off what I built and why, and what considerations did I take into consideration when I was building it. And last but not least, we'll cover useful resources. So I'll share some links to some useful resources I've come across. In today's world, data is absolutely everywhere. Companies rely on data more than most actually realise. We have data related to all sorts of things, and sometimes making use of this data can be hard. We need to learn to store data in a way that makes valuable use of the information we have at our disposal. If we have lots of data and we don't store it correctly, what's the point of having useful information if we don't take advantage of this data? Companies rely on data to enable and support business decisions every day, and normally this type of data is historical data, and in some cases can contain large amounts of historical data. Making use of this historical data can aid these companies and your company to make better decisions, and data warehouses aid companies with reporting and data analysis. The following are a number of questions we need to address. So why is data important? Well, data helps you understand and improve business processes, so you can basically reduce wasted money and time. Every company feels the effect of waste. It depletes resources, squanders time, and ultimately impacts the bottom line, which no one really wants. So the next question is, what is a data warehouse? But we'll cover this next when we talk about the data warehouse concepts. So next up we have, where is my data stored currently? So most companies have more data than they actually realise, and again, most companies have this data spread far and wide, making it difficult to make the correct business choices. I've seen it in a number of companies. Everybody has data all over the place. You might have data in databases, you have database in spreadsheets, you have access files, you have SharePoint, you have all these different teams, solution areas, so it's very difficult to get an idea of how much data you've actually got stored and where is it. So the next question is, where do we store data in Azure? So we can also store data in a number of places within Azure, and I'll demo each of these and talk about these later in the session. Next up we have, is my data stored securely? So data on the Azure platform is always encrypted in transit, except for data that moves within customer controlled networks, such as like an Azure virtual network and ExpressRoute. It's the responsibility of the customer to encrypt data within a network that he or she controls. And lastly but not least is, will my data reside in a single region? It's a very, very good question, and the answer is it depends. One thing you have to be careful about with data when it's to do with data residency in Azure is you have to be careful about backups and disaster recovery. If you want to do failover regions, you have to be careful about failing over to a region that your data might fail over from, say, Germany to West Europe. And if your data has to stay in Germany, then you can't do that. So it's something to think about, and it has to be planned out. So let's now talk about data warehouse concepts. So what is a data warehouse and why do we even need one? And that's kind of what we'll tackle next. So data warehousing improves the speed and efficiency of accessing different data sets that you might have at your company. And it makes it easier for decision makers to derive insights that will guide the business and marketing strategies that basically sets them apart from your competitors. So the 5 key concepts of data warehousing is data extraction, involves gathering data from multiple sources. So you might have all types of different data sources, and that's what that's all about. Finding where that data is. Once you've found the data, next is data cleaning. So you might have to find and correct errors in the data that you already have. And once you've done that, what you need to do next is called data transformation. And that involves converting the data from legacy formats to the format that you want to store in your data warehouse. Next up, you have data loading. And this involves sorting, summarizing, consolidating, checking the integrity of the data, and building indices and partitions. And last but not least, we have refreshment. So refreshing involves updating from data sources into the warehouse. So data cleaning and data transformation are important steps in improving the quality of the data and the data mining result. So that's a quick run through of the data warehouse concept. So basically you extract, clean, transform, load and refresh data. So at work I was asked by a customer to basically design a brand new Azure data warehouse from scratch. So when I started working on a project for a customer, they basically wanted to load data from a third-party website. It wasn't really an API, it was more just a file on a web server, hosted by another company. And they asked us, can we host this data within a brand new Azure data warehouse? So here's a quick list of the tools that I used when creating the Azure data warehouse. And I'm going to show you each of these later on. I'm going to cover each of these next, but I'll also demo this coming up. I'll demo how to use them and show you how to put it all together. So let's move on and take a look at each of the tools next. So Azure Logic Apps. Azure Logic Apps is a cloud service that helps you basically schedule, automate and orchestrate tasks, business processes and workflows when you need to integrate apps, maybe integrate data systems and services across enterprises or organizations. And Logic Apps simplify how you design and build scalable solutions for basically application integration, data integration, system integration, enterprise integration, and business-to-business communication. So whether it's in the cloud, on-premise, or even both. For example, here are just a few workloads you can automate with Logic Apps. You can basically process and route orders across on-premise systems and cloud services. You could send email notifications with things like Office 365 when events happen in various systems, apps and services. You could move uploaded files from an SFTP or an FTP server to things like Azure Storage. And you can also do things like monitor tweets for specific subjects. You could analyse the sentiment in the subject and create alerts or tasks for items that need review. So let's talk about how Logic Apps work. So every Logic App workflow starts with a trigger, which fires when a specific event happens, or when new available data meets specific criteria. There's many triggers provided by the connectors already in Logic Apps, and these include the basic scheduling capabilities, so they can set up how regularly your workload runs. So basically something triggers your workload and it'll run. And for more complex scheduling or advanced recurrences, you can use a recurrence trigger as a step in any workflow, and I'll show you an example of that. So on the screen here you can see we've got a recurrence and then an HTTP call, and from that HTTP column, create a blob, and then I'm basically creating another blob. So what I was doing here was creating a blob, grabbing the file, putting the file into blob storage, and then unzipping the file into a kind of folder. And I'll show you that in a little bit. Each time that the trigger fires, the Logic App engine creates a Logic App instance that runs the action in your workflow. And these actions can also include data conversions and workflow controls, such as things like conditional statements, switch statements, loops, and branching. So I basically make use of a Logic App to go off and grab the data from an external website and store the data within Azure storage. It downloads a zip file and then unzips the zip file into another blob. So I'm taking a copy of the zip file and then unzipping it as well. Next up, we'll talk about Azure Storage. So the Azure Storage Platform is Microsoft's cloud storage solution for modern data storage scenarios. And core storage services offer a massively scalable object store for data objects, for disk storage, for Azure virtual machines, file system services for the cloud. It's also a messaging store for reliable messaging and a NoSQL store. And these services are durable and highly available. So that means redundancy ensures that your data is safe in the event of transient hardware failures. You can also opt to replicate data across data centers or even geographical regions for additional protection for local catastrophe or even something like a natural disaster. So let's just say a region gets wiped out, you can back it up and restore to different regions. The data replicated in this way remains highly available in the event of an unexpected outage. So the services are also secure. All data written to an Azure Storage account is encrypted by the service, and the Azure Storage provides you with fine-grained control over who can access your data. So the services are also scalable, which means that Azure Storage is designed to be massively scalable to meet the data storage and performance needs of your application in today's world. The services are also managed. This means that Azure handles hardware maintenance, updates, and all the critical issues for you, which means you don't have to bother with that. It's taken care of. And the services are also accessible, which basically means that data in Azure Storage is accessible from anywhere in the world over HTTP or HTTPS. And Microsoft provides client libraries for Azure Storage in a variety of languages, including things like .NET, Java, PHP, Ruby, Go, and others. As well as that, they have a mature REST API. And Azure Storage supports scripting in PowerShell, Azure CLI, and the Azure Portal and the Azure Storage Explorer offer easy visual solutions for working with your data as well. And I highly recommend looking at the Azure Storage Explorer. It's really cool and really helpful. So the core storage services, the Azure Storage Platform includes the following. So Azure Blobs, which is a massively scalable object store for text and binary data. And it also includes support for big data analytics through things like Data Lake Storage Gen 2. It also has Azure Files, which is managed file shares for cloud or on-premise deployments. We also have Azure Queues, and that's basically a messaging store for reliable messaging between application components. Next up we have Azure Tables, which is a NoSQL store for schemaless storage of structured data. And we have Azure Disks, which is block level storage volumes for Azure Virtual Machine. So that's a quick run through of Azure Storage. Now, when it comes to where to create your data warehouse, you have different options, which include but are not limited to Azure SQL and Azure Synapse. So Azure SQL itself has many different flavors: SQL Server in a virtual machine, SQL Server managed instance, Azure SQL Edge, or just Azure SQL Database. So I chose Azure SQL for the data warehouse as the amount of data and the processing power required wasn't going to be significant, so this fits our needs. Cost also had to be considered, and that was another reason why I went with Azure SQL. So we'll show you a bit more of that later on as well. So let's talk about Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory is a cloud-based data integration service that allows us to create data-driven workflows in the cloud for orchestrating and automating data movement and data transformation. So Azure Data Factory doesn't actually store any of the data itself, it just moves data around and transforms data. It allows you to create data-driven workflows to orchestrate the movement of data between supported data stores and processing of data using compute services in other regions or in an on-premise environment. It also allows you to monitor and manage workflows using both programmatic and UI mechanisms. So basically, you create pipelines, copy data tasks around. You basically pull in some data, do whatever you need to do, and then move it on to someone else. So it's a lot of people use it for ETL type things, extract, transform, and load data. So that's kind of what I've been using Azure Data Factory for. So I'm using blob storage. I am taking some data from some CSV files. I'm putting the CSV files into blob storage, storing them there, and then I'm using Azure Data Factory to load the files from blob storage by creating a data pipeline, and then I'm moving that data from blob storage through the data factory and into Azure SQL. So that's kind of what I'm doing. So let's now talk about putting it all together. So here's a quick diagram of basically the design that I put together. So this is a diagram and we end up with the following. So on the left we have our external data sources, which can have a number of different types of files. You can have CSV files, XML files, JSON files, basically anything. I'm then using an Azure Logic app to grab the data from an external URL. The Logic app basically then creates a blob storage with an Azure blob, and then we use Azure Data Factory to clean up the data and then import the cleaned up data into the SQL data warehouse. From there, we can then report on this data using Power BI. So here's a very simple example of what a data warehouse might look like in Azure. Again, you can have all sorts of different types of data sources, different ways of ingesting it. You don't need to use a Logic app. You could ingest it straight in with a data factory. I'm using the Logic app to basically go off to the website to grab the file. I'm then putting the file into blob storage, and I'm then using Data Factory to load that file from blob storage and basically transform the data into Azure SQL. And then from there, Power BI is going to look at the data warehouse. Very simple, but that's basically one way of doing it. Okay, so let's now take a look at some demos. So here we'll take a look at Azure Logic Apps, Azure Storage, Azure SQL Database, and Azure Data Factory. And I'll try and demo how I put together this Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So let's switch to the browser. Okay, so now that I'm in the Azure portal, you can see that I am looking at a Logic app. And this is the designer for the Logic app. So for this project, what I was tasked with doing was go off and grab some data from a URL. And I had to do that once a month. So basically I have this recurrence task, which literally goes off, and basically once a month we'll call this HTTP this next task. This task here is basically going to go off to an endpoint. It's going off to get some data, and it's doing it every single month. So once it gets that data, what it's going to do is it's going to then create a blob. So it's basically going to create a zip file with the data and store the body of the blob content in a blob. So that's basically what that's going to do, and it's going to be a zip file, and then what it's going to do here is basically create a backup. So I have inside storage, I have a data files, zip files folder, and then I have a data files, zip files backup. So basically downloading a zip file, and I'm also taking a backup of the file. So let's go and take a quick look at that in Azure Storage. So let's open that up in a new tab. Just make sure we're signed in. And if I go to the storage account, this one here. If I go to the containers, go to data files, and here we have zip files. So I've got my zip file, and I've also basically taken a backup. So just to recap, this Logic app is basically going to, once a month, it's going to go off to this location here, download the file, store the zip file in this container, which is data files, zip files, which is here, and then it's basically going to take a backup of that and put that in the backup folder as well. So I've got zip files and a backup file. So that's me going off to a URL endpoint, grabbing a file once a month, and storing it in Azure Storage. So that's the first part of grabbing the data. So you might have data locally, you might have data with a customer, you might have data somewhere else, whatever, and I'm basically just using a Logic app to go off and get that data. Now you could use an Azure function, doesn't really matter, but I'm basically just doing this. Pretty straightforward, and it runs once a month. So on the 15th of every month, I'll go and grab the file, and then put the zip file here, and then take a backup of the backup of the zip file and put it here. Okay, so that's kind of that. So let's now take a bit more of a look at the data storage that we're using. So we're using Azure Storage, and we're also using an Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account for that. So this is basically designed for storing large amounts of data. So when you basically go in to do file, basically if you create a new storage account, there's a tick box to basically say that you want a data lake. And it's basically set up for enhanced performance management and security for storage accounts. So literally you create a storage account, you tick a box to say I want it to be data lake storage, storage v2, and basically you have containers. So you go in here and create a container. You basically do this to add a container. I just called one data files, and there I have zip files, CSV files, and I also created a folder called poison to store any records that might have some dodgy data or whatever. Once I'm importing these files into Azure Data Factory. So that's really basic stuff. It's basically just a storage account that's set up as a data lake storage. I didn't realise that an Azure Data Lake storage is basically just a fancy type of storage account. I didn't really know that. It's just a tick box, and that's the only difference. I actually thought Azure Data Lake storage was some sort of large service on its own, but it's actually not. It's kind of like an enhanced performance version of storage account. Alright. So that's the storage. Then we'll take a look at the SQL Server. So if I go back to here and I go to SQL Database, I'm basically just using the storage. What am I using here? I'm using a SQL Server. That's the server. Let me just go to the databases. So I'm using a general purpose Gen 5 2 cores database, and I'm using this for my data warehouse. So that's what I'm doing for that. And last but not least, let's take a look at Azure Data Factory. This is the kind of crux of it all. So let's go in here and take a look at Data Factory itself. So if I go in here and I go back to the resource group, and let's take a look at Data Factory. So I'm using Data Factory for basically the cleaning, the loading and the transforming of data. So if you're new to Azure Data Factory, it's really quite straightforward to use. Basically, once you create an Azure Data Factory, you basically just click on Author and Monitor. Okay, so now that I've loaded Azure Data Factory, you can get a Let's Get Started screen. So you can create a pipeline, you can create a data workflow, you can create a pipeline from an existing template, or you can copy data. You can also set up code repository and configure SSIS package integration. So I have already gone ahead and created some pipelines, but if you're interested in how to do that, home basically takes you back to the home, basically takes you back to this screen. Here you can author pipelines. So let's just do that. So if I go into author. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's create an Azure Data Factory pipeline. So to start off with, I'm going to click the plus up here to add a new resource. And then from here, I'm going to choose pipeline. So in this area here, you can see that there's different activities that you can do. So first of all, I'm going to give the pipeline a name on the properties on the left. To click the properties, you click on this area here. So let's just call this demo pipeline. Okay, and then I'm going to look at move and transform. So what I want to do here is copy some data into an Azure SQL database from a CSV file. So I'm just going to click copy data and drag that in. I'm going to click on the properties window just to hide that, and then I'm going to drag this up a little bit. So here's like your copy data activity. So under these different tabs is how you kind of configure it, and I'm just going to call it copy demo file. It's always good to give these things a name, otherwise you end up with it's kind of data sets, you end up with poorly named things. So that's one tip, definitely name everything. Okay, so we've given the copy data a name. We've called it copy demo file. Now what we need to do is choose a source. So I'm going to click on source here. You can see the red means there's one outstanding thing we need to fill in. So the source data set is basically where is the data that I want to import. I want to put through my data pipeline. So I'm going to choose, I could choose some existing source data sets, but I'm going to choose new. So this is basically where is the data coming from. So you have all sorts of different options. You have Azure, all the different Azure services. You can have database, different types of database. You can have file, protocol, NoSQL, and service and apps. And for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to choose Azure. And I know my file is within the Azure Blob Storage. We've used the Logic app to go get our data and put it into Blob Storage. So let's go with Azure Blob Storage. And now it tells me, now it asks me, sorry, choose the format type of your data, and I know for a fact that my data is CSV. But you can do JSON, Excel, XML, and Parquet, and a few other bits and bobs, but I know it's delimited CSV, so choose that, click continue. Now I need to set up a linked service. So a linked service is basically the underlying compute that Azure uses to basically connect these services together. So I'm just going to do a new one so I can show you what I need to do here. So basically I'm going to give it Azure Blob Storage Demo, give it a name. So basically here you have to basically tell Data Factory where is the resource that you're interested in. So if I choose my subscription and I choose my account name, then I just do test connection, check that it's connected okay, and this is me basically allowing Data Factory to talk to Blob Storage using a linked service. So you can have a linked service for all different types of services, but this is for Blob Storage. So click create, and there we go, so it's successfully created, and now I need to give it a path within Blob Storage to my file I'm interested in. So if I click on the little folder here, I want to go to, let's go to these files here, and then I'll double click on the folders, and then I'm just going to choose this CSV file here. Okay, and the first row is a header, yes. Click OK on that. And there we go. So now we can preview the data just to see if it looks as if it's come in correctly. Let's have a look. And it doesn't look like it has because it looks like the data in this CSV format is actually semicolon separated. So I can see that all the columns are at the top here and these are all the rows and it doesn't really line up. So let's fix that. To do that, you can click on open again here just to open the source data set. And this time I can look at the column delimiter, and change that to semicolon. You could have pipe tab or no, but let's go for semicolon. And just to check that that worked okay, let's preview it. Yep, that looks a lot better. Save that, and then basically close that. Just no, don't close that. Let's leave that just now. Basically, you need to publish everything before you click off of it. Publish basically just saves all the changes. It's very important to click publish all actually. It's an important point to make. Any changes that you make that you want saved, you have to publish back to Data Factory. But we'll do that in a little second. So now that we've set up the source, let's set up the sink. So we've set up the source as to go and grab the data from my CSV file, which is in Blob Storage. Now I need to tell Data Factory where am I going to sync it to. If I click on sync, again, I can choose an existing data set or a new one. Let's choose a new one. So where is the data that I want? Where do I want to put the data? So if I go to Azure and then I go to Azure SQL Database, that's where I want to go. I can choose an existing link service or a new one. I will choose this one in a second, but I'll show you what you need to fill in. Again, give it a name. Try and distinguish this so that it stands out from all these different namings that you give things. Again, subscription, give it the server name, give it the database name, give it the authentication, how you basically connect to the database. Fill that in. I don't need to fill that in, I'm just going to discard this one because I've already got one here. So okay that. Then I need to know which table am I going to put it to. So if I go back to open, I can say which table I'm going to go. So I'm going to basically go to this demo table that I've set up, and I can preview. Will this import the data correctly? Let's have a look. We haven't done that, but it doesn't show you it yet because we haven't mapped the columns. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we go to mapping now, you can click on import schemas, and what it'll try and do is map the schema of the import file to the schema of the database. Let's try that. So this is the source, this is the CSV source, and this is the destination, which is my new SQL Server table. And I can see that it pretty much matches up, apart from this column year, this is showing me that the mapping file, which is the source file, doesn't have this column. So I'm actually going to remove that because I don't really need here for this demo. So now I can see all the columns map up. Looks good to me. I'm going to publish all those changes. Basically it says, are you sure you want to publish them all? Yes. Let's just do a little quick count of the columns in the table. Okay, so there's no data in this table. And I'm just going to run this. Now to run this locally, you can basically, run it here, you can just basically do trigger now. So just before we run this, just to recap, we have a copy data task. I'm copying data from a source, which is a file within Azure Storage. And I've browsed it and previewed it and checked that it loads okay. I'm going to sync it to my Azure SQL table, which I've decided is going to be this table. And I've checked the mapping that all the columns should come in with the data types. So the CSV is all string and the database is all set up correctly. And then I'm just going to run it just to see what happens. So let's do trigger now. And then I can click run. Now if you run a data factory pipeline, you can click on this monitor icon here on the left. So I'm going to load that up and it basically says it's in progress. You can cancel it. You can cancel it recursively and you can basically keep an eye on it. So you can actually click on it. Let's just leave it running here actually. Just a wee quick refresh. Oh, it succeeded. Okay, so let's just do a wee refresh. It should go green. That's fine. Looking good. So let's go to SQL Server and just check that I actually imported that data. So it was 0. And we've now got 190,000 rows. Let's just do a quick... Let's just see if that loaded in. Yep, there we go. That's our data. So I've grabbed a CSV file off of a website from an energy company, imported it in and imported it into Azure Storage via a Logic app. So now that I've got the data in Azure Storage, it's actually a data lake storage rather than just a storage account. I then use Data Factory to load that file into SQL Server. You could load this into Azure Synapse just as easily, or any other database, but we're using Azure SQL for this demo. If I go back to the pipeline, that's just a quick example of how to use Azure Data Factory and setting up a Data Factory pipeline from scratch. So that'll be the end of this demo. Let's move on and we'll talk about some other stuff. Okay, so let's just do one quick recap of what we have in our data warehouse. So to first of all go and grab the data, we have an Azure Logic app. And this is the designer for the Logic app. So we have 4 steps. We have the recurrence, which is basically just something that recurs every X. So I've got every interval of 1 month. So on the 12th of every month, basically this is going to run. And what it does is it then calls this next step, which is an HTTP GET step, which is basically going to go off to this URL and grab the content, which is a zip file. It then grabs the zip file and creates a zip file inside blob storage inside Azure. And I've put it inside our data files, zip files folder. And then what that also does, it then also takes a backup of that file and gives it a date time. So I've got a backup of the file and the backups just in case I need it. And the reason for doing that is, with a data warehouse, you always want to have a copy of the data somewhere. Just for auditing or whatever reason you need to maybe replay the data and clean it up again, whatever. I just like to have a copy of the data inside the data warehouse. So I've basically got that inside the solution, I've got that inside Azure Storage. So that's kind of why I've got a Logic app. You could do this in a number of ways. You could use PowerShell, you could use the Azure CLI. You could even use Azure Functions, but I just did a Logic app because it's nice and easy, and I quite like Logic apps. So that triggers once a month on the 12th of every month when that file is going to be there. Right, so that's how that first of all gets the data. Next up we have the storage account. So the storage account is a data lake storage account, and basically that just means it's set up for high performance and large files, large amount of data. If I click on containers here, you can see I've got several different containers, and basically inside data files I've got the folders as we saw. So if you've got the CSV files, you can see the files, and I also have the zip files here and a backup. I'll just keep a copy of the backups. So that's really straightforward, nice and simple. Next up we have Data Factory, which is the next step. We have our pipelines, which we've already seen. So we have a pipeline here, and this is an example of what I'm doing here. So I'm copying the data to SQL Server from storage. I'm cleaning the data, fixing any data issues. I'm also doing a bit of generating hashes. That's just for checking the differences in both sides. I am then, let me just zoom out here a little bit. I'm then merging from a staging table into a live table. So I basically copy the data into a staging table, clean it up, do a little bit of hashing on both sides so that I can check the difference between production and staging and live, and then I merge staging into the live table. And that's basically triggered as well. So I have a trigger on here. Now if I look at the trigger is going to fire when any new file hits the storage account. So if a new file comes in on the 12th, I take a copy of it, I take a backup of it, and this Azure Data Factory pipeline kicks off instantly. So I don't need to touch it, it does it all for me. And that's done using a trigger. So if I go to the trigger and go new edit, I've basically got this trigger here, and basically I just have to give it the subscription, the container that I'm dealing with, the blob that I'm dealing with, and when an event, on the event of when the blob is created, this will kick off. So it's really quite powerful. So that's looking at Azure Data Storage Explorer, Azure Storage, and when a new blob's created, this pipeline gets kicked off, and I just set it to activated yes, and save that, and that will automatically do it. Need to make sure you click publish. I always forget to click publish. Don't forget to do that. Don't be like Gregor, forget to click publish. And that'll deploy the change. Alright, so that's another quick run through. So let's now move on and cover some useful resources that I've came across. Okay, so now it's time to talk about some useful resources, and I have a list of useful resources as you can see on the screen. So I did find a really cool Azure SQL Workshops content on GitHub, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Also wanted to talk about some Microsoft Learn links. So if you go into Microsoft Learn and search for Azure Data Factory, you'll get some learning paths and some learning modules. And if you're lucky enough to have a Pluralsight account, then there are also some excellent courses on there if you just search for the term Azure Data Factory, for example. And the last resource is my very own Azure Resources GitHub, basically a GitHub page with lots of resources. And let's go and take a look at all of these right now. Okay, so I am using Microsoft Edge, and I really wanted to show you what I do for when I'm doing talks. I basically use a thing called collections. So up in the top right hand corner here, if I click on collections, I have a list of collections for all the different talks that I do. So I've got one for community, learning, paid training, exams, Scottish Summit type stuff, governance, actions, but I've got one for Azure Data Factory, so I'm going to click on that. And these are just links that I have for Azure Data Factory. But first of all, let's go to my resource one first. So this is my GitHub account where I store all my useful Azure resource links for everything that I come across over time. So in here I have a list of resources for AKS, community content, data content, DevOps, Azure exams, Azure governance, Azure policies, talks that I've given, and some useful links. So let's take a look at the data ones, because that's kind of the ones that we're interested in for this session. So within data I've also got a Data Factory folder, but first of all let's talk about the data resources. So here is the link to the Azure SQL workshops. So let's have a look at that one first. So Microsoft have basically put together these SQL Server and Azure SQL labs and workshops, and they're really, really good. So you can do some data platform labs, and there's videos. There's also some programming. There's also all the presentation material, example code, references and tools, and basically learning how to self-learn. And basically you can take a look at all this different stuff. There's tons of really good content in here. Stuff for Python for data professionals, R for data professionals, SQL ground to cloud, machine learning, all sorts of really good stuff in here. So I just wanted to mention that first. There's lots of labs and workshops for SQL Server, so that's a really useful resource, and that's the link there. So the next resource I want to talk about is Microsoft Learn. So if we open this in a new tab, and I basically just search for Data Factory, because that's kind of what I was talking about. But you can also click Synapse Analytics. So here in Microsoft Learn, you get learning paths, and within the learning paths, you get modules. So let's take a look at, like, for example, what's a learning path? Architect a data platform in Azure. Let's take a look at that. So inside here, you have lots of different modules, and they cover all sorts of things. This one is Explore Azure Database and Analytics Services. So this will cover an introduction. You'll explore Cosmos DB, Azure SQL, you'll create a database and explore big data analytics. And there's all sorts of different learning paths and modules within Microsoft Learn on lots of really cool data platform stuff. So really, really good content in here. And again, that's just Microsoft Learn. Put in a search term and away you go. And the last one is, if you're lucky enough to have a Pluralsight account, I had a look at 3 of these courses. So the first one is Modern Data Warehousing at Scale using Azure Data Factory. Just take a really quick look at that. Basically, it's an intermediate course. It's a little bit old, this one, but it basically covers all sorts of things about creating a data warehouse at scale using Azure Data Factory. So that's lots of really cool stuff. And there's another couple there: integrating data into Microsoft Azure and building your first data pipeline in Azure Data Factory. So that's kind of just 1 or 2 resources. And if I go into Data Factory folder, there's a YouTube channel for Data Factory. So let's take a really quick look at that. The official Azure Data Factory YouTube channel, with all the videos about how to do all sorts of different things. So definitely check that out. There's lots of different videos in here, as you can see, all pretty decent in length. Some are short and some are quite long. So lots of really good stuff about ADF, Azure Data Factory. Definitely check that out. There's also, what else we've got? Another couple of Microsoft Learn links. We've also got dbanuggets.com. So Deepthi Go Gurus has got a SQL Server blog. She's just started learning Azure, so she's doing a lot of Azure SQL things. So keep an eye out for Deepthi's tweets and her blog. There's also the official Data Factory docs, and there's also the 2 Twitter accounts for Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse. So we haven't really talked about Azure Synapse, but Azure Synapse is more kind of a data warehousing solution for looking at historical data. And it's also very expensive, but that's not a downside. It's just something to keep in mind, that if you want to try and keep costs down, you don't always need to use the latest and greatest, most expensive tools in Azure. So I didn't use Azure Synapse, I just used Azure SQL. And that's that for the resources. Let's go back to here. Got some 1 or 2 useful links. So these are more general Azure resource links, things like Key Vault, Azure for Architect, deployment best practices, cloud adoption framework, some Azure tips and tricks, and kind of just general stuff in there. Alright, so let's go back and look at the collections again. So let's just open that up in a new tab. Again, under collections, under my Azure Data Factory links, I have links to Microsoft Learn. I have the link to the YouTube channel. Let's take a look at the official documentation for Data Factory. So there's lots of really good links in here. It's a nice little video introducing it. Tells you all about it. You can go and see the features. There's some interactive demos, the docs, customer stories, and frequently asked questions. And last but not least, let's cover Deepthi's basically she's sharing what I learn about SQL Server. So she started doing Azure stuff now. So she's started doing sessions about fundamentals for beginners for data flows. So this is basically Deepthi talking about how to get set up and started with Azure Data Factory, and it's really, really cool. So she's started to learn all that good stuff, which is awesome. So that's just some of the useful resources that I've came across. I'm not really a data person, but I've kind of been doing a little bit of data recently. I'm more a developer, so I've just been picking up links and useful links and kind of checking these things out. So please do check out most of these useful links. Again, I'll put up my Azure Resources link. It's just this one here. Azure Resources, and then check out the data folder if you're interested. Alright, cool. Okay, cool, that's me basically finished. I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone involved for today's Data Scotland, and thank you to Craig and all the organisers, and I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, then the best place to get me is on Twitter, which is here, just Gregor _Suttie. So please do reach out and say hello. Any questions, just let me know.